Well, it looks like it's a couple minutes after 3, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And then if somebody from the city decides to join us a little bit later, they can log in and we can get them caught back up if needed. All this will go out after the meeting as well for comments. So welcome back to the RSTP CMAQ Update Subcommittee. I know it's been a few months since we've met, but there's been a lot of work going on our end. And we're happy to share it with you and kind of kick this off because I think this is going to be the more exciting meeting, focusing on scoring and how to evaluate the projects. So to get started, I'll start with the opening statement regarding virtual meetings. Due to the 2020 COVID-19 virus and current guidance.
Miles?
Yes.
You haven't been with us in a month, so you don't know that we are not reading the statement anymore. As long as it's included in the packet, we don't have to read it out aloud.
Well, thank you, Nicole.
You're
I appreciate
welcome.
the heads up.
A little time saver.
In that case, I will just move on to taking the attendance. And Nicole, would you mind reading that out?
Sure. Thanks, Miles. City of Richmond, Ms. Clark. Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Here.
Henrico County, Ms. Smidler.
Here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Here.
GRTC, Ms. Del Ross.
Here.
And VDOT, Ms. McAdory.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, Miles.
Great. So I'll turn it over to you, Joe, for today's meeting.
Turn it over to me. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was going to lead this thing, but I'll do my best. So the next item then is the consideration of amendments to the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Okay, seeing none. The next is the approval of the October 13th meeting summary. And that requires an action which can be found on page 2 of the agenda.
And before we act on this one, Mr. Chairman, we do have one change from staff at the request of Ms. McAdory. We didn't note that Mr. Herman as an alternate was in attendance for the last meeting. So that'll be revised in the approved minutes when they're approved for today's meeting.
Thanks, Miles.
Okay.
Move to be approved as amended.
Correct.
Second.
Yes. Okay. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay. So can we move on to then the approval of the October meeting summary? All right. May I have a motion and a second, please?
I believe we just had the motion on that, Mr. Chairman.
I'm lost. I thought we had gone back. Liz had a change, right?
Just to the minutes. So
To the minutes.
It was an amendment to the minutes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
And
So my apologies. Miles, please save me.
okay. Well, I think we had a motion from Mr. Coleman and a second from Ms. Smidler. So I believe we just need to go through a quick roll call to approve the minutes. Is that correct, Ms. Mueller?
You can approve it by acclamation. So if,
Okay.
Mr. Vidunas just wants to call for
Sure.
ayes and nays.
I'll do that. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries.
Great. So with that, this takes us to the actual discussion item. So I'll take over now. Thank you, Joe, for getting us through that first piece. So we'll got a PowerPoint for you. Share here. Okay. So what we're going to start with is the review from the last meeting. As you recall, we were discussing the project readiness review and the initial project guidelines of what types of applications would be accepted for each category. So we received comments back. The deadline was November 6th. So we received comments from 3 of the members, so from the city, from Henrico, and from Hanover. So I wanted to share some of those comments, some of the main themes that we heard with the group, and then discuss some areas that we might need to go back and revise. We'll try and keep this brief to keep us on track for today. So basically what we received comments on, the first one was the LRTP consistency requirements. So we received a couple different comments about this, essentially saying, what is this? How does this impact our projects? Consistency has always been a requirement for RSTP CMAQ. Every time we do a review, we make sure that the project is consistent with the LRTP before it proceeds to scoring. So this isn't really new. What is new is the guidelines that are being adopted as part of this LRTP update for regional versus local projects. So that covers all of the different project types. And then essentially what would be needed, and something that we haven't really done a lot of in the past, would be an LRTP amendment process. So as part of the workflow, if you remember, if a project isn't deemed consistent with the LRTP, you need to amend the LRTP before it can go through and be eligible for funding. So essentially what that would look like, this is kind of a generic template for that. We haven't finalized it with this LRTP update, but essentially you would submit a project proposal to the TPO. It would be evaluated using the LRTP methodology, which I believe you've all seen last month, the initial stages anyway. If it's eligible, we would tentatively add it to an appropriate time band. And then we would have to redemonstrate constraint, which would essentially mean we would need to look at removing funding from a different project somewhere, since we are stuck with a set budget, essentially. From there, if it was needed, we would go through a conformity analysis, and then there'd be a TAC review, public review and comment, 15-day period, and then TPO approval. So it's a few-month process to add something new. I think the last time we did this was to add the pulse to the LRTP. So that was a few years ago. But under this process, if something came up new, like an economic development opportunity that you really needed to add a new project in here, this was what we need to go through. So there'd be a few months in there to get that done, but it would be possible to amend the LRTP. The second big thing we heard concerns about, and this one I'll open it up to a little discussion, is the VDOT vetting of projects. So we had initially proposed that the Richmond district would vet the schedules and the cost estimates in advance, so that when it comes to the TPO, we're basically able to just take those numbers in the schedules and move forward with them. We don't have to send it back out to VDOT. It was more of a time-saving suggestion on our end. The concern, particularly for Henrico and the city of Richmond, is that their projects are largely locally administered. They have a very different arrangement and limited, more limited role for VDOT in their jurisdictions. So an alternative proposal that we'd like to offer would be that locally administered projects don't require the VDOT concurrence, but anything VDOT administered would require it. It wouldn't be a formal pre-application process, which I think may have been the way it came off at the last meeting, but it'd just be more of a coordination between the sponsor and the VDOT district so that everybody's in agreement going into the project. The biggest goal here is for us to reduce the cost overruns and the delays in implementing the projects that the TPO is funding. So the question that this alternate the alternative here would leave is, how do we validate those locally administered projects? You know, if the local sponsor says it's going to take this much time and cost this much, how are we supposed to validate that if it's not going through VDOT? So with that, I'd open it up to any suggestions on this end. This is something that we're still working on putting together for the final draft to bring to you.
I have a question, if it's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in earlier. I tried. My only question or concern with the alternate proposal is the decision to locally administer a project is not decided upon until right before the project agreement begins. So I don't know. I mean, there's sort of a general consensus that most of Henrico's and most of the cities are, but I also know that that could be changing potentially in the future. So I just want you guys to be aware that that decision is not yet made at this point in the process.
And just, currently the way that we've done it, we've requested from the applicants whether they think it'll be locally or VDOT sponsored and administered. And that's kind of just been a question, a one-off sort of thing, but it's not binding at this point. So if we were to go through this proposal, we would need a way that we can make sure that these are validated and something that could be implemented. And this is, I know, a concern that's come up with the smart scale round, this round as well. And I've heard from several of you on that as well. So we're just trying to find a balance here that's going to let you have the flexibility to determine your own projects while still making sure that we're coming in, in budget and on time.
Let me jump in for a second and just to clarify, are we talking about locally administered or locally funded? Is that really, because I think as a locally administered project, we could be using TPO funds, and so that would be a concern of TPO. Whereas if we're spending local dollars, purely local dollars, then really it's on the locality to manage that.
Sure. This is back to RSTP or CMAQ projects that are locally administered. So there's TPO dollars involved in the project.
Okay.
I have one idea. It may be helpful, and you'll let me know if it's helpful or not. I guess for locally administered project, I mean, if they're going to have some consultant or someone else involved, there's going to be a second party looking at it. Can they simply say VDOT or a second party has confirmed the cost estimate?
So one of the suggestions we received was essentially to say that any engineer familiar with the project, essentially. So I think that might have been a little too general, but I think that Tom's suggestion may be heading in the right direction, that we're getting somebody else validating it beyond just the locality's staff. So I'd like to hear from anyone else if they have any thoughts on that.
This is Sharon. I guess the concurrence. I don't think we're opposed to having, Henrico, I don't think is opposed to having VDOT's concurrence. I realize there has to be something with spending TPO funds, another party to help verify the funding. I guess it's just more, what would be required, trying to, I guess, less surprises or communication of, no surprises, or just, I guess the STAR studies were a sore point before, and just making sure the cost estimates are valid or accepted by VDOT when we submit them. So I think it's just clarifying that. I don't think Henrico is opposed to getting VDOT concurrence.
So it sounds like what we could do is we could sit down with Liz and come up with a proposal of what this would look like in terms of implementation. So I don't think this will go in the document per se. I think the document's probably just going to say with the VDOT concurrence. But we could sit down with Liz and work out how does this actually function in practice, and bring that back as well as part of the overall approval that we're bringing to you. Does that sound like that would work?
Yeah.
Anyone else have any other thoughts on this? Okay. Go ahead.
I'm just a bit concerned, just having gone through a process recently with Smart Scale, and just trying to arrive at reasonable estimates. So, I think the bias on the locality's part is to kind of keep the price as low as possible. And the bias from the reviewing agency is going in the other direction. The only way that I really know how to address this with a lot of these projects is to have actually done some level of study. And until you actually, get to your 30% stage, it's really just kind of, it's a little bit more it's a little bit more further along than just taking a swag, but it's not too much beyond that because of all the unknowns. And I mean, I think we can do pretty well in terms of the construction and PE estimate, just kind of using some historical basis for that. But the right of way and the utilities is really, really difficult to try to estimate. And I don't really have the answer, like I said, other than to have done some level of engineering. The goal is very valid. I mean, that's what we all want to do, but it's a difficult thing to achieve, and I'm not sure that we would. I'm not sure that it would make a whole lot of difference by going through this process.
Well, and I think there may have been a little confusion on the front end. This is sort of what we go through already. I mean, when we get the applications, we send everything to the district to help validate the costs anyway. So that's a process we're already going through. The intent here was more to focus on how to streamline it so that instead of us getting your application and then waiting 2 months to validate it, that you guys were working with VDOT more on the front end. So it's less of a, here's a project they had no idea was coming and now they have to validate it. And instead it's something everybody's familiar with going into the process. So I don't think our goal is not to make it more difficult on you guys. The goal was here just to try and streamline our process. So I think maybe the best option would be kind of what Sharon suggested, that we work with Liz, come up with something to bring back to you that's a little more tangible, and see if it's something that you could live with, knowing, like what you just said, Joe, that the costs are in the early stages somewhat, there's a lot of unknowns, that you're not going to be able to get a perfect estimate without doing some sort of engineering. So, any other comments on this before we move on? Okay. So then the next one that we heard comments from you on from the last meeting were the caps on requests and the number of applications. So this was something we discussed quite a bit back and forth. The concerns were basically about the cap on the number of requests, that would be limiting a demonstration of need, that somehow if you can't submit all 15 projects, you're not able to show that you have 15 projects out there that need funding. And then the other concern that we heard was that when projects do get funded through the TPO, what happens if the cost increases? And there was a cap of, say, $8 million, and now the project costs $8.5 million. What do you do for that extra $500,000? So the intent of what we were trying to accomplish with these suggestions was to match our current practice, which essentially funneled the more expensive projects to RSTP, the less expensive projects through CMAQ, which are usually bike ped. So they're also good fit for the CMAQ program. And really just trying to make sure that we're matching up our funding with the project scale, because we do have some projects that are $60 million total cost. The TPO is not funding all of it, but funding a large chunk of it. And in terms of the scale and what we actually have each year, it's a big ask. So some alternatives that we've come up with that might help to alleviate some of the concerns we heard was to increase the cap. So rather than putting a cap at the annual average amount, maybe it's 1.5 or 2 times the average annual amount of funding. Another alternative would be essentially a case-by-case review at either the TAC or the TPO level. So if an application came in and it was 8 million originally, and then it went up to 9 million, just like we do now with cost increases, we would go through TAC, and basically TAC would also need to agree to exceed the cap. So it would be essentially just part of the process. We could build that in. The third, which is I think the staff preference, and I'm not sure how you'll feel on this one, would be that the project sponsor would fund the excess cost with outside funding, not TPO funding. So if a project were to exceed the cap, then whatever it goes over that limit, that would come through CVTA or other outside funding, local funds, whatever is used. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on any of these options. That way we can include it in the final draft that we bring back to you.
Perhaps you can refresh my memory. Don't we have a limit on how much they can increase over and above the cost? Is it like 10% or something right
Correct.
now?
So currently it's 10%, and if it goes beyond that, it has to go before the policy board through the TPO. Otherwise, it just goes through TAC to get the increase.
Hey, Miles, one suggestion on the cap, if there was a number of projects cap, and there, I think I heard the local concern was that, you know, they don't want to miss an opportunity for a need to go on record. It could be if there's a 10, let's say a 10 project application, maybe they could also have a separate, like an appendix that lists, you know, like future applications or the projects that they want to keep on that list. Just kind of like the LRTP constrained plan versus the vision list. Just a suggestion or something.
Thanks, Liz.
I definitely like the idea of having a vision list or something so that there's a record of those projects in the plan, even if they don't get funded.
And just my thought on saying that is that way the TPO and whoever else is validating, you don't spend time. If you know they're only going to get 10 applications, they don't spend time validating 20. Just validate what you think could potentially get money.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to a cap on, you know, the number of applications to submit. That sounds fair, and we can, you know, if the appendix, like Liz mentioned, is a good idea, just so we can see what else may be applicable. But the cap on the cost, how do does that move each year? How much, like if there's, I don't know, however much allocated that year to spend, yeah, I'm curious how to cap the cost if that changes each year.
Sure. So, I mean, essentially it would change every year. So we get in the spring, the next 6-year estimate for the SIP, and it would roll off of that each year. So it would increase, but not significantly from year to year. So you would see it slowly, I guess, with inflation, essentially increase to the cap, but we're not going to see a significant change. You know, it'll be 20 million up to 20.5 over the 5-year window or something along those lines. It wouldn't be something significant that would really, I think, be the make or break in a lot of these cases. Because usually what we're seeing is, you know, it's a $30 million project coming in for a $20 million pot.
That helps. Thanks, Miles.
I just want to make sure I understand. Can you explain that first option, Miles? So just give an example of how that works.
Sure. So basically what we had proposed initially was it would be the average of the 6 years of funding. The total amount of funding for the program is what we would use as the cap. So for CMAQ, as an example, I think it's about 8.5 million. So what we could do is increase that. Instead of 8.5, we could bump it up to 12 or 17, put a higher cap for CMAQ funding. So if a project is submitted, it could go up to that total cost and get CMAQ funding. And then the other two options were essentially to say you either need the TAC or TPO to approve anything going beyond the initial 8.5, or the sponsor just needs to find the funding to go beyond 8.5.
And this just got me thinking about TA and like thinking, you know, that was like a 2 million. Well, I didn't know it at the time, or anyway, with the applications, if there was a 2 million cap, and then, you know, Henrico applied for more, and then, but then there's CTB member allocations. And then if we didn't apply for it, then that may not have worked out. I mean, given it was a very, you know, important project, the Fall Line Trail, but I don't know. I don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot or something and missing out on some funding.
So it sounds like that you guys need a little more thought on this. I'm going to send out this presentation at the end of the meeting like we did last time, and you can mull it over. And at the end of this meeting, we can set a date for getting comments back, and we can go from there, because it sounds like this one might need a little bit more time to kind of think through the implications of each of the options.
That sounds good, Miles. Thank you.
Hey, Miles,
Yes.
for the second option, how often did that happen where you would have to do kind of a case-by-case review in kind of like previous years? Has this ever been something that is this what we're currently kind of doing?
Sure. So we do this currently for any time the cost increases by 10%, more than 10%. It has to go through both TAC and TPO for approval. It's usually rolled into the allocation cycle, so it's not something that's a standalone, but occasionally we do have standalone. Like we have one project right now that we're looking to fill a gap, and it'll have to go through this process now. So it happens every year. It's just usually it's built in as part of the allocation cycle, so it's not something that stands out.
Okay, that's,
Yeah.
I just wanted to track if we were going to explore that option, how much in terms of a delay, in terms of that project being able to move forward or getting the determination if the funding would be available, what that is, and then also the amount of staff time as well as kind of meeting time that would take to kind of include these type of, for that option. So I just was trying to figure that out too.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what we would probably do is do what we do now. So bring back the current projects and existing project requests at one TAC meeting, and then bring the new projects at the next meeting. And if there's anything that needs TAC and TPO approval, it would just come at that first existing projects meeting as part of the allocations. And we would just have a separate line in the resolution that says it also approves exceeding the cap, or whatever we call it when it's implemented. So I think it'd be fairly simple to implement from the staff side. It's just essentially we need to build it into the process. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I don't hear any other questions on this. So like I said, we can think through this one, and please feel free to send me comments. The last item from the previous meeting that we wanted to go back over was supplemental data. We had concerns raised about the data requirements. In general, the TPO applications are less intensive. And if you've seen what was proposed at the LRTPAC, which is what we'll be discussing later, it's really largely going to be TPO driven is what we're proposing right now. So I don't think this is going to be an issue. The main things that we would need will be the application, obviously, then cost estimate, schedule, description, and a project sketch or shape file. I think those are going to be the primary things. The rest of it's mostly going to be, in terms of what we're proposing, would be either model driven or GIS. So it'll be largely staff analysis. So I think this was a concern more from the city side. So I'm not sure if anyone else had any questions in terms of the data. Okay, well, hearing none, then I will go ahead and move into the next section, which is the point of today's meeting, and that's our scoring. So this is a quick refresher. This is the general outline of the document. So what we're talking about today is another step in the 4-step process, and then the scoring for each of the 3 programs. So the first program is the RSTP program. The federal requirements essentially that it's prioritized for the TIP. Other than the requirements in terms of what types of projects are eligible, that's the big thing that we need to worry about. The implication with the prioritization in the TIP is that we can't just set aside funding for particular modes or jurisdictions. It has to actually be some sort of selection process. From the state side, it's really, we're coordinating with VDOT and DRPT has needed to for any of the transit projects. In terms of what the other MPOs are doing, Hampton Roads uses its LRTP scoring for some of RSTP, and they're slowly moving towards using the same scoring across both programs, but it's kind of a process still. They've been working on that for about a decade. Most of the other smaller MPOs use something very similar to what we're using currently, which ultimately all comes from the 1990s scoring that Hampton Roads was using that they've replaced. So our current process, essentially we break things down into several categories. You can see it's primarily based on mode, so highway, transit, intermodal, ITS, then there's planning studies, and then active transportation projects. The scoring is quantitative and qualitative, and our measures are really focused on the need rather than necessarily the benefit of that proposed project. So an example for highway projects, there's a congestion measure, and it's essentially you get 10 points if congestion is severe currently and severe in the future. There's no analysis of what the project will do to address the congestion. It's really a focus on what is the need that exists for this project. So what we're proposing, there's 4 broad categories that we would split projects into. And the scoring would be tied a lot more directly to our LRTP. The new projects category essentially is using the exact same scoring as the LRTP prioritization, which, as you probably all know, is in the process of being finalized still. So I'll go over what was proposed last month just as a refresher briefly. But the focus is really on the performance and the benefits of the project. So the first recommendation would be a category of studies. So we have this as a separate category now. It would be all the planning studies. Examples, the West Creek IJR, Chesterfield has a Route 360 Super Street study. There's every year we get probably somewhere between 5 and 10 applications for studies. They're kind of foundational. The big thing with this is we would want to focus on regional projects and policies and advancing our regional plans. So the separate scoring criteria here, as we're proposing, is very similar to what we have in place currently, but essentially 40 points would be, does the project advance does the study advance a project, recommendation, or policy in the LRTP? And then do the study goals address the following? And these are broken down to match the new LRTP goal categories and some of the performance measures. So this weighting essentially mirrors what was proposed with the LRTP, subject to change as those weights are adjusted through the LRTP process. But basically, we'd be looking at safety and crash reduction, mode choice, equity and access for disadvantaged populations, connections to regional activity centers, resiliency and protection of the natural environment, regional economic growth and development, and congestion management and mobility. So again, these weights are subject to change, but that's kind of what we're thinking now. This is very similar to what we have in place currently. There any feedback on the study side?
So to do a study, it would need, sorry, I need to read this again, to be in the long range transportation plan, or no, it just says, or is the study necessary to advance a project recommendation? So you get 40 points if it's in the LRTP. If it's not, you're kind of at a disadvantage.
Or if it's you know, a local type project, but it's still advancing one of the goals that we've set. So it's, I think it's written generally enough that it could apply to projects. But the goal is that what we had previously also said, is this study necessary to amend the LRTP? What this is really focusing on is the document as it is, advancing that. And if somebody wants to amend it, that needs to come kind of separately, that push would come. But this is otherwise the same language that we have today. Any other questions, comments on the studies? And again, you can send the comments afterwards. This is just kind of a first introduction so everybody can kind of see the direction we're headed or proposing right now. Okay, so the second category would essentially be the new projects, which would be any new facilities, non-operational improvements to existing facilities. So Atlee Station widening, West Broad Street pedestrian and transit improvements, Hull Street Phase 3. Most of the projects that we get fall into this category. And this one is the one that we're proposing to follow the Connect RVA scoring. So basically, this would allow us to have consistent prioritization across all of the TPO's efforts and ensuring that we're promoting the same vision with the LRTP that we're promoting with our funding decisions. And then this would be a cost benefit analysis. So it'll ensure that we're making the most out of our limited dollars. So you've probably all seen this. I think everybody's on the LRTP advisory committee, but essentially what it's proposing, there'll be standardized buffers for project impacts. And these are some examples, but essentially major arterial capacity changes or interchanges would have a 2-mile buffer. There'd be a 1-mile buffer for like a minor arterial or collector capacity project, intersection improvements, and then half mile for the active transportation or transit stops. And so this would be for all of the GIS analysis. And essentially the categories, again, the weights subject to change based on the feedback at LRTP, but this follows SMART scale. So it's crash frequency and crash rate, and it's EPDO. So it's adjusted essentially based on the impact or severity of the crash. The one thing that is different is we are proposing to do it per million vehicle miles or million entering vehicles for intersections, just because that's an easier analysis for us to put together at the staff level. It takes less time than doing the full-blown version that VDOT and OIP put together. For access and equity, it's basically jobs accessible within set times, and it's via different modes, and then access to jobs for communities of concern within that same set time. And I'll also send out, I meant to say this already, but I'll also send out for all of you, in case you haven't seen it, the document that was sent out to LRTPAC, which is essentially the breakdown of how all of these would be assessed. Because I know I'm kind of just going through them quickly, but just so you're able to see exactly how these would be evaluated and can assess the merits then. Then the other half of this access one is destinations. So access for all population to destinations, and then destinations for community of concern or EJ populations. So essentially, and this was something raised in the LRTP, but equity would be 10% of the overall score as proposed. The next would be economic development. So this is basically new jobs served, and it's based on percentages of TAZs, and it's depreciated as you get farther from the project. There's a connection to truck intensive areas, which is basically any areas with concentrations of employers that have heavy truck traffic, and a connection to those, and it's certain project types that would qualify there. And then truck throughput and improvements in truck throughput. For the new jobs served, just to give you a quick visual, I think you've all seen this, but essentially it's a multi-ring buffer, and the farther out you get, the less credit you get for the jobs in that band. And based on the tier of the project, it goes out a set distance. So tier 1 project, which would be like a bike ped project, you only get the half-mile buffer. But if it's a tier 3 project, like an interstate widening, it would go out 2 miles. So you get credit for jobs all the way out here, but at a depreciated rate. So only 12.5%. So it decays the farther out you get from the project, essentially. This was taken from Harrisonburg. So this is something we're borrowing. The next category would be environment and land use. So percentage of environmentally sensitive and resiliency risk areas within a quarter mile. This is essentially a SMART scale measure. We've added a few additional categories to look at, but it's essentially taken straight from SMART scale. Emissions reduction would be the change in the ozone precursors, which is measured using our model. VMT per capita would also be an output from the model, and so it'd be the decrease in VMT per capita. And then connection to activity centers, which is essentially the new jobs and population in these activity centers. That's what we'd be looking at. So it's essentially, are these projects serving the growing areas within the region? And then the last section for new projects would be mobility, so person throughput and person hours of delay. And this one is the least weight as proposed currently, so that's at 10%. And again, all of these weights are being reviewed right now. So I think some of you have already given us comments from the LRTP side. So this is essentially the same thing, you're seeing it again. But we're looking at those, and the goal would be, as that changes for LRTP, we would update these numbers and measures to match as well. So any questions on the proposed new project scoring, what that looks like, how anything functions, anything on that end? Okay. Yeah, I figured since everybody's seen this in LRTP, if you haven't already sent comments to us for that side, please get me comments because I'm working with Suab on updating it for the LRTP as well. So we can make any changes based on feedback we get from you guys as well. So definitely leave this one open for comments. The last two categories we're proposing are something that's new. We don't have this currently in the guidelines. And what we want to do with this is these we haven't really proposed any measures yet, but we want to see if this is something you'd be interested in. So the first would be to pull out operational improvements and make those separate from the general new projects. So that would be all of the traffic surveillance, any of the control systems, transportation demand management. It's basically stuff that's going to make the existing facilities work better, but without really building anything new. Is kind of the, I guess you could take it from federal code. So we have a lot of these projects. Most of them go through CMAQ, but the thought would be for RSTP, we could split them off. And the rationale is that these are very different in terms of how they're functioning because they're essentially maximizing what we have now rather than adding on to our existing system. So, and with the TDM programs in particular, the funding is ongoing. So it's a continuous commitment year after year, especially on the CMAQ side. So the question is there any interest in splitting off operational improvements from the overall general scoring criteria? And if there is, we can come back with some scoring factors and work with you on that. But we just wanted to see if that was something that the subcommittee was interested in first.
Just my main concern is coming up with a scoring system that would maintain an apples to apples comparison. You know, I wouldn't want a scoring system that puts the thumb on the scale to make the score higher.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on splitting out operational improvements?
Then I worry about trying to set caps like for each phase if we allow so much money for the operations and so much money for the new projects and I don't and then where do you draw the line? And some people may want to that year put all their money in the new projects or
so that's kind of where we ran into the problem too. As you can see, my questions are, do we do it off the top set aside?
Oh, yeah.
How do we split it? So
yeah,
I think
sorry, I didn't read down, but yeah, you're right. Maybe it's just subliminally. Huh.
So it sounds like, I mean, from the two comments we've had, it sounds like the concern is essentially that operations would be weighted differently and then they'd be taking out of the overall pool instead of just competing for, is this project making the improvements? Does anyone else really feel strongly that this should be split out as a separate category? Okay, so I think what we can do then is just roll this one back into the same new projects category and essentially just call that a projects category instead of new projects category. So you've either got a study or you've got some sort of project and they can all roll into that same section. We had a fourth category. It was a similar proposal. So this would be for preservation and maintenance type projects and whether those should be split out as something separate. Some examples recently would be like replacement of rolling stock for the transit system or the bulkhead repair at the port. Basically things that just keep everything in working order. It's not even making any improvements. It's essentially just keeping the system working. Same sort of questions. Is it worth splitting off and how would we score it? So does anyone have any thoughts on preservation and maintenance as a separate category?
Hey, Miles, I have a question kind of going back to the previous category.
Sure.
Kind of thinking, I noticed TDM, I'm thinking that's ride finders.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like a program. Should you, and rather than having operations set out, because that could be a typical CMAQ project, could be an operations project. But a program is something totally different. But is that the only project that's like that? Is that the only sort of program?
We've got 3 programs. So we have the ride finders. The city has the employee trip reduction program, which is essentially the same thing.
Yep.
And then we have the port, I guess it's the green operator program, which has been
Right.
kind of expanded to include like the barge purchases and everything like that. So it's those 3 programs. And that was kind of the thoughts on splitting some of this off, is that maybe those operations would primarily programs might want to be pulled out and scored separately. But ultimately, I think we could evaluate them the same way we do anything else. You know,
Sure.
if it's reducing VMT, you'll get credit for the congestion relief and everything. So, I mean, I think we could put it through the same numeric scoring. It's just, it would take a little bit of creativity on our side to figure out how it fits into those.
Right.
So anybody else, any thoughts on preservation operations? If not, it sounds like we could probably just scrap these 2 proposed categories and just kind of have a split between studies and projects. Okay, well, hearing none, I will tentatively move forward with that, but obviously we'll send this out. And if you have other thoughts, you can email me and let me know. So that's everything for RSTP. So we've got CMAQ and TA, and I promise they'll be much shorter. So CMAQ, basically the primary requirements is we have to do some sort of emissions reduction analysis showing that the pollutants are going to be reduced by the project. We have to demonstrate the cost effectiveness. So what is the cost per ton of a pollutant reduced? And then we have to prioritize it somehow to include it in our tip. So that's basically what we go through with our scoring. The big thing from the state is we're required to coordinate with the CTB, and then we coordinate with environmental staff with Dan Grinnell to do these assessments as well. So it's kind of a mix of what's been done. Hampton Roads essentially uses the same methodology that we do, mostly because we took it from them originally. BAMPO recently rewrote theirs a couple years back, and they've sort of combined RSTP CMAQ into one. So there's no real distinction. It's basically, if a project's going to qualify for CMAQ, then they could fund it with CMAQ, is kind of the way they look at it more. And then MPOs outside of Virginia use very different criteria. So they look at things using all sorts of other measures. So the way ours breaks down now, you can see there's 3 different types of signal intersection projects, 3 different types of transit projects, Bikeway, ITS, and then other. And those are the categories that we have. And the measures are all basically built on studies from the 1990s in Hampton Roads. So everything we have is assuming that those studies are still relevant, and they're, you know, from the early 90s for the most part. So pretty dated. So an example, the coordinated signal system, essentially we take the average speed and then we assume 4% improvement based on the study, and, or excuse me, 4 mile per hour improvement. And then we just calculate, okay, well, what's the emissions factor with the 4 mile an hour improvement? And that's what we get. So it's really just based on this assumption that that study's still relevant. Bikeway projects don't really even have a defined methodology. So what we do currently is basically we look at the change in VMT if vehicle trips were displaced by bike trips, and then we use that to calculate the emissions. But our guidelines also say we could do a qualitative assessment, so there's no need for it to be quantitative under our guidance. So it's kind of open-ended. And then when you get to ITS projects, it's basically, it's project specific, use whatever. There's no real defined methodology. It's kind of a case by case. So VDOT has been recommending to us for a while to use the existing CMAQ toolkits that FHWA has, so that we're not having to reinvent the wheel every year and do our own analysis when there's easy to use spreadsheets out there. It's a significant time commitment. Over the past 5 years, we averaged 18 candidate projects per year. So Dan has to go through each of those and score them, look at the applications. call up the applicants when something doesn't look quite right, figure out what's going on. So it's been quite a bit of time commitment on his end, and kind of with the TPO staff as well being kind of the middleman. So we're just going back and forth between the sponsors and VDOT. So their recommendation has been to use something else that just gives you a number, makes it numeric, and it's not all the calculations and determining what the best methodology is on projects. Some other factors that we looked at is the long-term benefits versus short-term benefits. The way the guidelines are written and the way it's being calculated, a lot of it's really just kind of the first year outcome. So we look at the first year the project's built, what would be the change in VMT? That's the change in emissions, and then we annualize that with the cost. So it's really focused on what that first year benefit is. Some project types don't have the same benefit over the entire life of the project. So that's something that we're not really considering. So maybe we need to look not at the first year, but a later year for the project. The other thing is other MPOs outside of the region look at consistency with the regional plan. So CMAQ isn't limited to just congestion side. It's also, is this advancing our LRTP? So what we're proposing is essentially just use the same scoring as RSTP. Since we're already calculating the emissions reduction for the ozone precursors, which is what we're allowed to use for CMAQ, we would just do the same calculations and prioritize those projects. So if they fit in and can be funded through CMAQ and they can demonstrate that they're going to reduce the emissions, our proposal is just to use that. And then what we would do is just calculate those emissions cost benefit analysis when we submit the packet to VDOT and federal highways. But essentially everything would be scored the same. So any thoughts on that of streamlining the scoring between RSTP and CMAQ? Okay, well, hearing none, I'll just send this out and let you comment back. I think if you're okay with RSTP, you'll be okay with the CMAQ scoring, but looks like Liz has a question, comment.
First, I wanted to laugh at Tom's big thumb. That was awesome. I saw that. I just would wonder, are there any cons to doing that? Are there any negative impacts that you guys are aware of?
No, I mean, essentially, the difference is emissions aren't the only thing we're looking at.
Right.
So the plus is that we're able to look at a bigger picture and make it more comprehensive. The negative, I guess, if there is a project that only narrowly reduces emissions but doesn't have any other benefit, it won't score as well.
Right.
But it's the same idea. We're promoting that regional goal.
And would you say that doing that might give you a little bit more funding flexibility program wide?
Yeah, I think, and I've seen other MPOs that do this. They don't even ask for, do you want RSTP or CMAQ necessarily? They just say, do you want federal dollars on your project? And we'll figure out which source makes the most sense based on what you're submitting.
Sure, because it makes sense to use the CMAQ where you can, and then RSTP for everything else.
Right. So I think it would give us a little bit more flexibility. And again, it's just that consistency too. So now CMAQ and RSTP are streamlined. There's no concern that somehow CMAQ projects are being prioritized and they're easier to get funding for, which would push people one way or the other. So.
And then would this also at all help with the equity? Because these are combined. I don't know if it would or not, but just putting that plug in case it would help.
Yeah, I mean, that would still be assessed. So there's still a 10% of the score overall would be based on that equity measure. So I think it would help to at least, we would be including it, whereas before with CMAQ, that wasn't directly related. I mean, I think pollution improvement is good overall on the equity side, but I don't think it was directly included in what we were looking at.
Okay.
So. Any other comments? Okay. So then the last one is the TA set aside. And this one is the smallest pot. It's the one that we really kind of have the least influence over right now. Basically, the federal requirements say that the MPO is responsible for project selection in the big metro areas. The way that the CTB and VDOT have set it up, VDOT runs a statewide application and scoring process. We can choose to to participate or not, but as far as I know, none of the MPOs have opted out, none of the large TMA MPOs, so there's no point in not using it. I mean, it's already there. They're doing the heavy lifting for the initial evaluation, so it makes sense to use it. Hampton Roads was the only MPO I could find that had any sort of TA policies adopted anywhere, like a scoring process. And essentially their process says they'll follow VDOT scores, they'll look at consistency with the long range plan, and then each project that they recommend has to have some sort of justification of why this project over another. What the VDOT scores look at is 5 categories. So there's project funding, which basically says, are there going to be any outside sources? Is the sponsor contributing more than the minimum match? The concept, is it fully evaluated? Will it help mitigate negative impacts? Improvements to the existing network, will it take cars off the road? History administering federal aid projects. So essentially, does the sponsor have experience? Will this project actually get done? And then the last is project readiness. Does their design underway? Has the right-of-way already been secured? Has the prior phase already been completed? Basically, how ready to move forward are you? So the way that it works, there's 3 evaluators that look at each project, and then they put their scores together and get an average. And that's your merit score that you get on the project. And then if it's an existing project that previously had funding, for like another phase, it also gets a priority score, which basically says how ready are they for the next round of funding. So that's a 1 to 6 score. So our MPO policy, we have nothing right now. And I've heard from several of you that you have different thoughts on what the best use of this funding is. So staff's thought was to use the VDOT scores, but also look at some regional factors on top of that. So again, going back to the equity conversation, we would want to look at equity in the evaluation. And this is the same analysis that we're doing for the LRTP and for our EJ. So essentially you'd have a map of all of the EJ areas and see whether the project is connected to those based on the half-mile buffers that we apply for the bike ped projects. And then the other piece of it would be, is there any sort of promotion of regionally important active transportation? So essentially, is this something we've already identified in our MPO bike ped plan? And is it something that we could say, yes, this is advancing that plan, which is a component of our LRTP essentially. So the proposal would be to do something very similar to the LRTP and the RSTP CMAQ scoring, be a cost benefit analysis. So 80% would go based on that statewide merit score. And then 20% would be on the equity and the regional value. And it would be cost benefit, except it'd be in 100,000s instead of 10 millions because it's a much smaller pot. So that's our proposal. I'd like to hear if there's any comments on either the 2 regional factors or if there's a preference to just use the statewide score.
I like the idea of adding in the regional score as well. I think I need some more time to digest the
Right.
slide on them. But I appreciate the option.
Any other questions or concerns about the regional? And as I've said several times before, anything that you can email to me would be great as well afterwards. So I'll send this out as well as the LRTP methodology document that was shared last month. And then you can take a look at those and get back to me.
Miles, I know I'm not a voting member, but I also like the additional regional pieces you put in. For one, it tailors more to the needs, but also I know that, you know, the equity analysis and the regional value, those are 2 things that you guys have wanted to focus on for a while. This is a good way to incorporate that.
And I will say, unofficially, this has been looked at before. I mean, this wasn't part of any official like scoring process, but it is something that's been considered in previous years as part of the TA selections. So this is kind of just formalizing some of the different various elements that have been looked at over the past, 5 years with the program. So looks like, Joe, you had a comment?
No.
Oh, okay.
No comment.
Just saw you unmuted. Okay.
I've been unmuted, I'm sorry.
Well, I will send this out then. So that's kind of the 3 programs and what we're proposing on scoring. What I'd like to recommend is we do what we did last time, which is if you could get me comments in the next 2 weeks. That way we have time to digest it before we bring it back to you in February, and basically say, here's what we heard, here's what things we need to consider a little bit more, and we'll work on drafting this into the actual document. We didn't prepare a draft this time because I think we were expecting a lot of comments on this, so I think there'll be a lot more feedback, and we'll be able to draft something once we've got that finished. So anyone have any other questions about this process or any of these elements before I wrap this up?
Hey, Miles, it's Tiffany. I just kind of wanted to say thank you for putting this all together, especially after coming back from paternity leave and the holidays. So, you know, as DRP is a non-voting member, we really are just here more in advisory capacity, as Liz has been throughout this meeting, for example. I always want to be conscious about what we do in terms of trying to streamline the process that still makes our localities comfortable. Because for me, you know, anything to make it easier to apply for RSTP and CMAQ in the midst of also handling smart scale and any other, you know, grant opportunities that might come around, I think that it makes sense. But, you know, as the discussion and more information is absorbed, we may be, you know, to the full group when we present this to TAZ, there may be concerns about we might be overlooking some things moving forward. But I think the overall guidelines about trying to make these procedures a little bit more codified, especially dealing with overages on the projects, have been great. So that's the reason why I haven't really been able to discuss this so much, because I really do want to keep it to a local regional discussion for you all, because it really just has the biggest impact for you.
I appreciate that, Tiffany. Thanks. Well, don't see anyone else, so I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Yeah, again, thank you. That's excellent job. There is a lot to digest. I know that I need to go back and kind of think about and digest all of this, but very nice in putting all of that together, Miles. So without further delay, our next meeting is on February 8th. And if nobody else has anything else for the good of the order, then we'll go ahead and end this meeting. Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
See ya.